Most of human physical and cognitive evolution has been driven by our need to survive hostile environmental threats and our need to form effective social groups for mutual survival. But in the modern world, much of our survival is determined by financial and legal algorithms that involve very little physical interaction on our part. Bank accounts, legal texts, tax forms, these are the new factors that can determine whether we live in poverty, luxury, or even a jail cell. Our ability to make shrewd calculations in these areas often feels like we have to play lawyer and accountant just to get by in life. But at times it doesn't feel natural. We don't get to do the old school thing of just pick an empty field to grow some food in, farm some animals and build a home. The evolutionary factors of physical fighting, resource gathering, basic shelter building, these are instincts that we don't get to indulge in very much in the modern world. And I think the most basic problematic element is that intense physicality is often missing from our lives. Movies and video games often fill this gap by providing compensatory fulfillment of our desire for intense physical activity. Running, jumping, climbing and fighting with fists, melee weapons or guns. And certain movie genres such as horror, action, war and thriller feature emphasis on these physical activities. It's even more frequent though in video games. And the Doom series certainly plays to this desire for a physically intense and active experience. In the nightmare hellish worlds of Doom, the bankers, accountants, politicians, lawyers, estate agents, landlords and police officers, who all wield so much influence over our daily lives, usually by the stealthy weapons of paper, documents and computer data, in Doom, these opponents are replaced by humanoid monsters whose threat is physical and immediate. The close spatial proximity of these opponents allows us to indulge a basic instinctual fantasy of beating and killing the enemy in a physical fight. I'm not saying the player consciously views these monsters as substitutes of people in positions of perceived authority in real life, but it could well be a subconscious element for some players. After all, the demons of the game seem to exist in a sort of hierarchy. The further into the game the player gets, the bigger and badder the enemies become, just as moving up the hierarchical ranks in real life often exposes career climbers to more and more cunning, manipulative and ruthless bosses and competitors. So we could think of the bigger monsters in Doom as domineering heads of institutional religions. There is a spiritual framing to some of these monsters. Or we could think of them as corporate fat cats or government dictators, whatever. Anyone who's in a position of authority. I'm not saying the game designers intended this, but I am saying that some players probably subconsciously perceive them in that way. And there are lots of other first-person shooter games that have players fighting against totalitarian or technocratic enemy regimes at the plot level. Undoubtedly, those game narratives appeal to the player's real-life objections to what often seems like non-stop attempts by technocrats at weaving a 24-hour surveillance system and suppression of all manner of natural human instincts like, free speech, and even the right to see our friends and relatives under the latest exaggerated blitz of fear. Anti-technocratic shooter games allow the player to vent a bit of frustration against these kinds of threats, and the same with movies like The Matrix. So, you see this monstrosity? His name is Sir Alphonse Gertrude von Steinberg V of Castle Angnor. He's the CEO of Superior Stock newspaper. You see this fruitcake? His name is Chief Officer Alfredo Rudstein Piers, Order of the Garter, and winner of last year's Corrupt High Official of the Year competition. Or how about this beaut? His name's Terence Hans Smytheworthy, dominant shareholder of Sadism TV and architect of the Gag All Peasants Declaration. Okay, I'm exaggerating of course, and I certainly wouldn't pin this as the central appeal of the game, but I think these comparisons between in-your-face monsters and unseen economic, technocratic and political authority figures in life are probably there at a very subtle level in the minds of some players. However, there is an irony to this. In the game, the player uses industrial and technological weapons that are the product of a financially driven society. It's the same irony found in a lot of real-life violent political movements, in which the insurgents seek to destroy a social system by using the weapons of warfare that were created by that system. It's the same irony of us using social media to speak out against a technocratic control grid. For example, the centrally constructed web infrastructure gives us the ability to speak out against centrally controlled systems, even though we're doing it via that system. Like people complaining about big tech media control, but doing the complaining on big tech media websites. And there is basically a non-stop online informational war going on, of course, which we're all caught up in as foot soldiers for one cause or another today. But anyway, back to Doom. Also important in Doom is that the boring physical safeness of our civilized world is discarded, in that the player is likely to be bitten or shot to death if they stand still. Of course, hardly any of us would want to experience the Doom horrors as an actual real-life event, but like I said, it's a compensatory fantasy driven by our natural fight-or-flight instinct, which is largely vestigial in the modern world. I believe Doom stands out against other video games in part because of the savagery of the physical threats presented. There are straight-up shoot or be shot war games. There are straight-up fistfight games too, but in Doom the enemy wants to not just shoot us, but often wants to bite or crush us, and on a more subliminal level they want to torture us too, to burn us and tear our bodies apart. This intention on the monster's part is often communicated by the presence of mangled and impaled corpses, some of which look like the player, directly suggesting that the fight is about avoiding such a hellish physical fate. In the latest game, Doom Eternal, the player is actually taken on a sort of a trip through hell and put into cages at certain points as if they are being processed like a tortured soul. So these threats are of the most savage kind, and the battles are gory and intense to match. And like I say, this is a kind of a break from the boring physical safeness of modern everyday life. In the original Doom games, the physical intensity was enhanced by moments where the player can briefly acquire from time to time the ability to punch monsters into mincemeat. In the most recent Doom games, this hands-on fighting is transformed into a variety of glory kills. These extend the punching physical encounter to include wrestling, kicking, snapping limbs, crushing skulls, gouging eyes out, tearing open rib cages, all manner of hands-on murder. There's even an awesome crucible sword added later in the game for a medieval hack and slash feel. And the only thing that seems to be missing is the player actually inflicting bite wounds of their own against the enemy. However, in Doom and virtually every other first-person action game, there's an interesting paradox regarding our frustrations with the number-crunching accountancy rules of the modern world. In these games, the player can be shot, punched, bitten, burned, but instead of the player's character being physically inhibited by these forms of damage, the damage registers on a universal health meter, a health bank account if you will. There's also a numerical armor account. Enemy health and armor is also calculated on a volumetric accountancy manner as well. And there's the basic accountancy aspects of ammunition expenditure, collecting ammunition, collecting health and armor top-ups, just as one collects paychecks in real life. So ironically, there is a number-crunching accountancy to life and death in this game. From that, we could assume that the player's mind does actually perceive a certain amount of benefit in having accountancy-based rules of existence, but I think it's more to do with the limits of complexity in video games. In Doom 2016, the ability to stagger opponents with shots leaves open a window for a hands-on or blades-on close-up attack, which was a nice break from the usual approach of shoot them until their health account goes overdrawn. And in Doom Eternal, the most recent in the series, some enemies have individual parts of their anatomy that can be destroyed, thus crippling the creature's abilities for the rest of the fight. These changes seem to have been embraced by players positively, suggesting that the old volumetric health meter isn't satisfactory to the experience. It would be pretty interesting to see how players would respond to a video game in which both player and opponents could suffer a much wider variety of semi-crippling physical damage based upon how they get attacked. Imagine first-person shooter battles where a leg injury limits the player's ability to run, or an arm injury means they have to resort to single-handed weapons for the rest of the fight. If taken to a higher level of realism, perhaps the player tries to take out as many enemies as possible in a battlefield before they inevitably die, and then the player has to respawn as a second soldier who carries on the fight, even picking up ammunition from the dead body of the previous player character. And then they do the same as a third soldier, and so on, each successive soldier having the odds slightly in their favour because of the compound damage done to enemy forces by the previous soldiers. I'd love to play a game like that, and I can't recall having ever played a first-person shooter game that worked along those lines. But my point is, if games existed with that kind of physical realism, would most players prefer it to the standard health and armour volumetric bars used by games like Doom? I think most people would love it, provided the controls weren't too fiddly. Now, the excellent Kingdom Come Deliverance went for a fighting system sort of along these lines. However, the combat controls were really hard to get used to. The stealth element was what I most enjoyed in that game, by the way. Brilliant game if you haven't played it. If you like stealth games, go get Kingdom Come Deliverance. It's awesome. Also noteworthy is that in Doom, the legal jargon and financial puzzles of real life are swapped out for spatial awareness puzzles instead. Colour-coded keys are hidden in the levels and need to be found to open locked doors. Observant players will pick up on visual spatial clues as to where they can find hidden stashes of ammunition, health kits and other useful items. It's kind of like a game of hide and seek or treasure hunt, and the player has access to maps in order to aid in these treasure hunt tasks. But the battles themselves are spatial puzzles too. It's not just about shooting monsters with the right kinds of ammunition, it's about dodging, choosing the best distance from which to fight, keeping aware of where you might be attacked from outside your field of vision. It's about using parts of the environment as a shield, luring enemies into vulnerable spatial positions, and anticipating from which directions and from which parts of the environment a hidden enemy might suddenly jump out and attack. Again, the legal jargon and accountancy threats of the modern world don't fit with our natural instincts. Doom and other first-person shooter games offer a compensatory and instinctive experience of solving survival problems through strong spatial awareness. And it's not just about picking a single place to fight from. When it's at its best, Doom forces us to keep moving and selecting different fighting positions. Last thing, although the glory kills of the most recent Doom games are very satisfying and add new gameplay dynamics, those new games also compromise their upgraded physicality by having the player mess around with a lot of customization and upgrade options, all done in menu screens that can be accessed at any point, even midway through a fight. For me, this breaks the sense of physical immersion in the battles, and it's a factor that wasn't really present in the original Doom games. In those games, you simply had the weapons you picked up along the way. Perhaps the best of both worlds could be achieved in the next Doom game by only allowing the player to select a limited number of weapons and upgrades at the start of each mission level, and then they have to stick with them for the entire level. And if they're lucky, they might pick up an extra weapon in the environment. Make the wrong choices and you need to restart the whole level with a better selection of weapons suitable for the unique dangers of that level. And that was something I liked in the old Doom games. When completing a level, you were only able to take into the next level what you managed to keep until the end of the previous one, but you might stumble across an extra weapon or two in that next level. So there was a compound benefit of doing well in early levels in order to stock up for the more difficult ones, but it didn't require immersion-breaking menu access midway through fights. And another factor that I find sometimes spoils the immersion in the newest Doom games is the more complex controls. It's great that the player can do more, but in the middle of a fast battle, I often find myself taking a few seconds trying to remember which button activates the flamethrower, which one throws a grenade, which one swaps my grenade for the freeze bomb, which one activates the crucible sword, and so on. Often this delay in remembering button commands, or frantically trying to find them and pressing the wrong button commands, results in death during combat, in which case I feel like I'm sort of cheated, like I'm wrestling more with the controls than with the monsters. In the original Doom, the controls were kept extremely simple. Even the vertical access of the shooting was handled automatically by the game. These simple controls allowed for a more reflexive, fast-paced battle experience. And while I do love some of the modded versions of the old game, the requirement of the player in some of those mods to handle the vertical and horizontal aiming when using a controller For me, it slows down the natural reflexive feel of the vanilla Doom games. Don't get me wrong, I really like Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal's even better, and the modded versions of old school Doom, they're really fun as well. For me, Doom 3 is the one that I find the most generic and least satisfying, but the original Doom games, the old school ones with their ancient graphical style, they still have a gameplay magic of their own that brings me back from time to time. In some ways, I still prefer the originals to everything that's come since. Okay, so that's it folks. What you've just watched here is a segment of a much bigger Doom analysis video that I'm working on, as there are lots of other psychological appeals of these games. So subscribe for more, sign up to my Patreon account and become a monthly supporter, and keep an eye on my website for the latest digital download content, which at the time of me posting this video includes a batch of discount offers. You've been listening to Rob Ager of CollativeLearning.com. Thanks for watching. Bye bye folks.